And now I'm very excited to welcome Dana R. Fisher, celebrating the release of her book, Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. Dana R. Fisher is a renowned sociologist, professor, public speaker, and author of over 75 peer-reviewed articles and 7 books, including American Resistance, From the Women's March to the Blue Wave, and Activism Incorporated, How the Outsourcing of Grassroots Campaigns is Strangling Progressive Politics in America. Dana R. Fisher's research focuses on climate politics, civic engagement, and activism, and democracy. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Financial Times, Vox, and more. She herself has appeared on ABC, CNN, MSNBC, and the PBS NewsHour to discuss her research and share her views as a self-proclaimed apocalyptic optimist. Dana R. Fisher serves as the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity and a professor in the School of International Service at American University. Today, Fisher will be joined in conversation with Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali is a thought leader, strategist, policymaker, and activist committed to fighting for environmental justice, economic equity, and political empowerment. He is an acclaimed keynote speaker who has been featured or cited in over 300 news publications, and he has been a guest lecturer at over 100 colleges and universities, and he is committed to bringing about positive social change for vulnerable communities through active work on environmental, economic, and public health policy. And now we are so grateful for the opportunity to host this incredible event today and to share in the celebration of Dana R. Fisher's new book. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali and Dana R. Fisher to Politics and Prose.
Thank you all for coming. Wow, we're lean and mean tonight. All right, here we go. Okay, so we thought I would just do a short overview of the book, and then we are going to have a conversation and then start thinking about what you want to ask, because we want to hear from everybody. Well, I'm Dana Fisher, and thank you. I want to just give you kind of an overview quickly of the book and how it came to be. So I wrote this book after studying climate policymaking and climate activism, and simultaneously observing the worsening climate crisis for the past 25 years. The new book brings together ideas that I have developed over the years to understand how far we will have to go to keep our planet habitable. Saving Ourselves maps out a feasible path to the other side of the climate crisis and explains the role that we will all have to play in saving ourselves and getting to the other side. So I'm going to share with you 5 really quick insights from the book. 1, the climate crisis is worsening and current policies are not doing enough to stop it. So the book tracks the climate regime starting in 1992 through to the most recent round of negotiations this past fall to show how, given the outcome of the recent round of negotiations, which ended in Dubai in December, and concluded with this extremely bland statement about how we one day maybe are going to phase out fossil fuels, it's abundantly clear that the climate crisis is going to continue to worsen. And as a result, we are going to see more climate shocks that come more frequently and with more severity. So insight number 2 is that as the climate shocks come more frequently and with more severity, we're going to see more social conflict. Social conflict will come from resource scarcity, it will come from extreme events, and an increasing climate migration. That is migration, well, we see a lot of migration already, and we see some of it is due to climate, but as extreme events make areas uninhabitable, people will move. And we know what happens when people move. There is lots of conflict that results already. So as climate shocks and their effects grow, they will motivate what I call an anthro-shift. An anthro-shift occurs when a perceived risk reaches a critical threshold and leads people to alter their behaviors. And it will compel social entities to respond and mitigate the risk. But to reach that tipping point, we need to have enough shocks that come frequently enough and are durable enough that people feel forced to make that change. Anthro-shifts open up windows of opportunity for policy change, but it takes a lot to get people to be motivated to make those changes and push for those changes. To address the climate crisis sufficiently, we need to get beyond incremental change to systemic change. So insight number 3 is that since policymakers are continuing to spin their wheels and businesses are bipolar, either, some of them are pushing for a clean energy transition while others are digging in their heels and trying to extract as much fossil fuel as possible while they still can. The best way forward and the most likely way forward is through civil society. Civil society and social movements are the social actor most likely to push for the level of authorship needed, but so far the climate movement has not mobilized the masses. To date, only a small proportion of society is engaged in the climate movement, but the movement is growing and evolving. As I talk about in the book, as the movement has evolved, there is a growing what we call a radical flank that has emerged, which is engaging in more disruptive tactics to try to draw more attention to the climate crisis. Some of the recent and notable examples of this type of activism include people throwing soup and paint, disrupting events, slow marching, bird dogging, and blocking buildings. Radical flanks of social movements tend to be unpopular, but they also increase support for moderate flanks of social movements, and we've seen that already within the climate movement. So far the climate movement does not have a radical flank that is comparable to radical flanks of previous movements like the suffragettes or like the civil rights movement, but we are still in early days. In Saving Ourselves, I document how the radical flank is evolving and that it's not a monolith, and it includes folks whom I call shockers in the book. Those are people who are aiming to attract attention by shocking the public. They're the ones who are throwing the paint and throwing the soup and gluing and blocking, etc. and so forth. But there also are folks who are the groups that I call disruptors, and the disruptors are using nonviolent civil disobedience as part of a broader campaign. And when they do that, they're integrating their civil disobedience into campaigns that are also embedded in their communities and target other social changes. Historically, the radicalization of social movement tactics has led to the emergence of counter movements and to law enforcement getting more repressive. This cycle of increasingly confrontational activism along with repression is likely to lead to violence that targets activists, which will only draw more attention to the movement itself. So in general, it's bad, it's getting worse, and nothing we've done so far comes anywhere close to what is needed to solve the climate crisis. However, that's the apocalyptic part. There is reason to believe that both large numbers of activists and disruptive protests will be necessary components of the climate movement before they lead to outcomes that respond sufficiently to the crisis. This is especially true given the oversized role that fossil fuel interests have played in blocking climate action for decades now. So the book ends by providing 3 takeaways about how we're going to save ourselves and what it will take to get us there. And 2 of them are for activists or people who are interested in activism, and 1 is for everybody. So the first one is that we need to create community and real solidarity within the movement. And that involves activists from multiple social movements working together in solidarity and recognizing the way that they are connected, and they can be connected based on the issues that are of importance to them. This is particularly important when we think about intersectionality, we think about frontline communities, we think about communities of color that are facing other challenges, and also when we think about labor, which has historically been in conflict with the climate movement. Number 2, we need to capitalize on moral shocks that include violence. And moral shocks here are what I talk about in the book as these moments where social movements motivate people to be aggressive against them. And we see that already. In fact, we just saw that. So there was an event a couple days ago where J.D. Vance's fundraiser was interrupted. And one of the activists, who happened to be a former student of mine, was actually choked by a person who was in the group and ended up having these horrible bruises. And there's lots of discussion about how they should have gone farther. That was sent out on toxic locations. But this is a very common form of escalation. It happened during the civil rights movement. It happened during women's suffrage. And it is extremely likely that it will happen again. But these moral shocks, while horrible, also are moments where we can draw attention to the way that the movement needs to bring in the masses and the ways that we can build solidarity. So I suggest we learn the lessons from the civil rights movement, which took advantage of violence against those engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience to mobilize sympathizers to the cause. More recently, we saw in summer 2020 how peaceful protesters getting tear gas here in our nation's capital motivated many people, including senators and other elected officials, to come out in the street in solidarity. And finally, we must cultivate resilience. And when I talk about resilience here, I'm not just talking about environmental resilience, but also social resilience. First, we need to prepare our communities for the types of climate shocks that are coming. As communities experience more heat waves, more floods, more extreme events of all sorts, people will become unhoused. People will become, in need of support. And building strong social ties within communities is absolutely necessary for people to be prepared and for communities to be prepared and to be resilient. Because given the fact that we know that we are not yet at a point where we are slowing down even the climate crisis, climate shocks will come and communities will be affected. So we all need to work together, those people who want to be activists as well as people who just want to be active citizens, to prepare ourselves and to prepare our communities. And that is the only way we are going to save ourselves.
That was fantastic. Can we give her another round of applause? Well, it is an honor and a blessing to be here with you. I've been a big fan.
A little louder.
I was saying it's an honor and a blessing to be here with you and of course with Dana. I'm a big fan of the work that you've done in preparing the next generation of leaders, but also in bringing what my mother would say is real talk to the sets of situations that we have in front of us, both the opportunities and the challenges that exist. And I was talking to my mother about this event tonight, and she said, well, why don't you ask her, when she first began this set of work, what was your vision for what you were moving into?
Is it just on? Oh, it's on. Okay, hi. So do you mean when I started doing all the work or when I decided to bring it all together into this book? Right. Which one did your mom mean?
Your mom. I think my mother meant when you were younger and were starting this work. So like when I first started doing this work, I had the false assumption that in about 4 or 5 years we would have taken care of all the environmental injustices and we've been able to move forward as a country together. So back then, what was your vision?
So back then, I believed that I would bring data to power and everybody would go, oh, we need to deal with the climate crisis. I mean, back then, as I talk about in the book, I used to go to the climate negotiations. And every time, I mean, I know you were there too, and we'd be like, we're going to solve it. We're going to save the planet this time. Nobody else is going to have to dress up like a polar bear. And and they used to have, there was just wonderful, like there were so many performative protests that happened early days when civil society was allowed into the negotiations. People would dress up. They had, my favorite part was they did the Christmas carols where they redid all the words so they were about climate change. Those were so beautiful. And we really walked away and be like, this is the time. Oh, not this, next time. We're going to get it. So I really thought that I was gonna do it that way and that my students were going to be all so proud. And I would say, way back when there was a problem, it was called climate change. But it didn't work out that way, right?
Yeah, no, we still got a lot of work to do. So when I was talking to my mother and thinking about you and thinking about the book, I was reminded, I'm a Baldwinite. So James Baldwin is, like being here surrounded by all this literature is a comfort zone for me. And James Baldwin once said that I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. And as I was reading your book, which I've read twice now, I was thinking about the sets of promises and actions that folks in the NGO space have made, folks in the government space have made, folks in the business space have made. Can you talk a little bit about those commitments that folks said they were going to do and how it has not yet transpired in the way that helps us to address what science is telling us that we need to do?
Sure. Well, the easiest one, excuse me, the easiest one to talk about is the way that businesses have made all these promises. I mean, even businesses many businesses said they were going to phase out fossil fuels, or they were gonna commit to net zero, or they were gonna at least cap their emissions, right? And just about all of them, well, not all of them, many of them that are linked with fossil fuel interests have basically walked back in the past year their commitments, which is just outrageous, right? Because the world's on fire. I mean, and this year, every month has been above any, broken every record that we've had. So that's just crazy to me. So I don't know how to talk about that one except to say that we really shouldn't expect much. I mean, this is also coming from industry that knew about the climate crisis, which we didn't call back then, back in the 1980s, right? And it was well documented that it was happening, and instead of sharing it with the public and trying to figure out what we were going to do, they buried it, right? So we shouldn't expect much there. With regard to government, I mean, the thing that's so challenging here is that I really do feel like the people who are in office now, I certainly think the Biden administration is really trying. And I mean, and I told this story a bunch before. So I studied climate politics. I have studied so many failed bills that have tried to go through the U.S. Congress to address climate change, to do a cap and trade, to address climate security, et cetera, and so forth. And they all the papers end with, why did they fail? You know? And I finally got to write a paper about the success with the IRA. But the IRA was a success because of giveaways to fossil fuel interests, right? And the Mountain Valley Pipeline, you know, so it's really challenging because I understand the way that compromise is so necessary here, but we cannot get where we need to go with it. And that's the problem there. With regard to NGOs, I mean, it depends on the NGO, right? But there are a lot of NGOs that have really gotten in line and they just want to, I feel like some of them just want access to power rather than to be successful in stopping the problem and calling, quite frankly, BS when BS needs to be called, right? You guys know who I'm thinking about, so.
Yeah, we won't call any names right now.
Let's not do that.
Well, let's do this, because we are literally 24 hours away from the State of the Union last night. Did that, because optimist is a part of the title that was shared in relationship to you. How did you feel based upon where we still need to go with some of the things that we heard last night? We know it was a plethora of different topics that were covered, but did it give you any hope? And if not, that's okay.
Well, okay, so first of all, I was very happy that the message was stronger than I expected. And I mean, my response is very incremental. I mean, it was better than I thought it was going to be. It was stronger than I thought it would be. And it was absolutely nowhere near where it needs to be. And in this case, the biggest challenge was, so this isn't even about solving the climate crisis. This is about solving the 2024 crisis here, because we are faced with a very, very dangerous election, a very, very dangerous situation with our democracy. And I know way too many youth activists who are telling all of their people not to vote. And what was said at the State of the Union last night was absolutely not sufficient to get those young people to vote. And it was also not enough to get them to help campaign, which is needed for us to see any success potential for the Democrats in the 2024 election. So, I mean, it's interesting because I did have a journalist ask me, they said, well, given your vision, don't you think that the Trump administration would get us there faster? And which is a very kind of uncomfortable question, and that would, I mean, it would bring on the apocalypse faster, right? I mean, I think most of us in the room right here would agree with that. I don't know if that will get us there faster. I think we could also end up with an autocracy, which I'm not sure is good for anybody. I do think we will likely see tanks in Washington, D.C. again, and I do not want to live through that again. So, yeah.
So let's tie that together. So you talk about in the book quite a bit about the anthro shift and risk, especially for those of us who understand that dynamic. There are risks associated with folks not voting, right? But also, can you also talk about, in relationship to the book, and you touched on it a little bit when you shared sort of a quick summary, I think folks still need to really understand anthro shift and the risk that is associated with that. And then I love the way you brought COVID into helping people to understand what this kind of looks like.
Great. Okay, it's funny because so anthro shift originally was a social theory that I wrote with my colleague and friend Andrew Jorgensen back in 2019, published in the journal Sociological Theory. 5 people have read it, as most social theory articles are. But we worked for 10 years on that article, and I was like, you know what, there's something here for climate. And he and I both work on climate in different ways. So I then wrote this piece called Anthro Shift in a Warming World, which was all about COVID, that was published in Climate Action, the journal. And that actually became the backbone for the argument in the book. So in it, I talk about how this notion of the anthro shift, which is all about how the different actors that interact with one another in our society, which is the state, the market, and civil society, are in specific patterns in terms of the way they work with one another. And in certain moments, there'll be a strong sense of risk that will jostle the way they work with one another. And an example that we actually give in the original paper is the Trump administration coming into power, the Trump election. Because during that period of time, there was a large group of the population that felt this strong sense of risk and voted based on that. And it really, it shuffled the way the whole world worked, right? So that's one example. But in the book, I talk specifically about COVID and the pandemic and how the fear and the sense of risk that we all had in the beginning led to huge social change and opened up these windows of opportunity for social change. So you may recall, one day they canceled school for 2 weeks because we'd be done with the pandemic at that point. They closed, social mixing stopped, transportation, stopped. People went in their houses. We baked bread. We homeschooled. We did all these things, and the world changed. All of the ways that the world worked changed, and that is an anthro-shift. The thing that's interesting about the theory of the anthro-shift is that it's what we call multi-directional, which means that we can make social change, but then if the risk goes away or the perception of risk goes away, we can slip back. And that is exactly what happened during, as the COVID pandemic wore on. Some people got sick and didn't feel like they got sick enough. Some people got vaccinated. Some people decided that it wasn't worth it because they weren't that worried. And all of a sudden the world went back to normal. So here we are, and I do not see one person wearing a mask, for example, right? I know there are a couple people in the store, but I just don't see them right now. And that gives me a sense of the idea of how substantial and how durable the risk has to be to get us to push for the kinds of social changes we're talking about. Because even those of us who feel strongly that we need to do something more to address climate change, and we know that it's going to be substantial, it's still going to be hard. Because, that's the reason that we haven't gotten there yet. And so it really needs to be a tangible sense of risk personally. And that's why climate shocks are what I think will push for that, because people will start to feel risk of the flooding and the extreme events and the hurricanes and the wildfires, which, by the way, the fires have started again in Canada, so prepare yourself for another summer of smoke, right? And I remember when the smoke came down last summer, there was like a couple weeks where they closed down, like recess for my son's school, and people went inside, and I remember all these people saying, see, it's a disaster that's going to make us get to where we need to go. And then it blew away, and then it came back again, and people were like, yeah, I'll just wear a mask, it's fine. Baseball can go on, right? People got used to it, and they didn't feel the risk. That tells us how severe the risk has to be, which is why I'm an optimist, but I'm an apocalyptic optimist, because we really need the orange skies and the disasters. We need what happened in Pakistan happening all over the world probably to get us there. And unfortunately, that means the frontline communities are going to be hit hard, and developing countries are going to be hit hard.
And I think that's one of the tough things for folks to deal with, is that vulnerable communities, Black and brown communities, Asian and Pacific Islander, indigenous brothers and sisters, lower wealth white communities are the ones who are going to carry that burden first, and are the ones that are going to be hit the hardest. We often say, what we know, what we say. And so I think a part of it is also, and you talk about this later on in the book, about making sure that we have the infrastructure that's in place, making sure there's the mitigation that's necessary, but also make sure there's resiliency. Can you talk a little bit about that, and I'll tie it in as we move forward.
Sure. So mitigation is important. I contributed to the IPCC. I'm not a natural scientist, but I'm very, very well aware of all those models, right? We're going to have to get the carbon out of the atmosphere. Not only do we have to, stop putting carbon in the atmosphere, but we're going to have to get some out. So that mitigation is all about addressing the carbon that's going in the atmosphere. But there's already so much carbon in the atmosphere. There's so much warming. We're already more than 1.5 degrees above, average, and it's going to get worse because there's still carbon going into the atmosphere. Because look outside, you can see the carbon going in the atmosphere coming out of tailpipes, etc. So, given that we know that people are going to be hit with climate shocks, and as a result, we need to adapt. And adaptation, the way I like to think about it, is we need to create resilience in terms of how we're going to adapt our communities to be able to handle more extreme events, more flooding, more heat waves, but also the community part of that. Because communities that are hit with extreme events, think about communities around Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria, and the communities that were hit there, and the ways people were displaced, and the ways people needed support and the ways that communities, I mean, and when those kinds of things hit, whether, and this is something I say when I talk to a lot of young people and I talk to a lot of like youth climate groups, and I say, you know what, TikTok is not going to save you. And you can, if you need water or you need somebody to help you muck and gut, which is a key part of responding to extreme events, TikTok's not going to help you. I mean, maybe you could put a call out on TikTok. Maybe people would come. I don't know. I'm not sure. It didn't work so well with the Willow Project. But what I can say is if you build real roots into your community and you build resilience in your community, those are the people who are going to be there for you when you need them. And that's what we need to prepare for.
Let's talk about, when we talk about the climate crisis and how we address it, it is a multiple set of things that go on. We often push a lot of responsibility onto the individual, and not much, we don't focus enough on the systems, right? There's an old quote that says a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. So let's first start with the individual and then move to what we've seen around systems and what we need to do in relationship to systems.
Okay, so with regard to the individual, and I talk about this at the beginning, well, not the beginning, somewhere in the middle of the book, I talk about the way that we know that fossil fuel interests have redirected a lot of conversations about climate change on individuals over time. And I talk about how they even came up with this cool term, the carbon footprint, and anybody who wanted to do anything about climate change should be dealing with their own personal carbon footprint. Don't think about the fossil fuel companies. Think about your carbon footprint. Now, it's interesting. I mean, so I have had a bunch of conversations about this, and I actually did this podcast with a high schooler today who was just so wonderful. And she and I were talking about this, and she was like, do you think that we should even do anything individually? I mean, like, recycling stinks. And I was like, I actually think we should do everything. Like, this is an all of the above time, moment. Not all of the above energy. I'm talking all of the above actions that we can take. We should be doing, and we should be proving to anybody who asks us that you have done what's needed as part of addressing the climate crisis. And then it's a lot easier to then be like, and now we all should work collectively, and now we need to change these systems because the systems need to be reformed. So with regard to systems, I mean, I think that we just have so many systems in place that, as I talk about in the book, have been really captured by these concentrated, privileged interests, and most of them are fossil fuel based or funded by fossil fuels or connected to fossil fuels, who have access to resources. Think about all the subsidies that are available for extracting resources in our country, but all around the world, and access to power. And that happens through both, being repeat players in terms of communicating to power, and that is like elected officials and other government actors, but also the money that's going into them. And there's been some really interesting research done that shows how even Democrats who say they care about climate change, if they take fossil fuel money, when it comes down to it, they vote for the fossil fuel interests over the people. And that's the kind of system change that we really need.
A part of that is the no money, the fossil fuel pledge.
Fossil fuel free, yeah.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, that's a wonderful, Oil Change International, I know, ran that, but I'm hoping there's going to be more of that because we need that. And there's like the Climate Hawks vote who only support folks who don't take fossil fuel money. Yeah.
Definitely. So we're talking about power of the people and power to the people because it sounds like governments, of course, we have to push them, hold them accountable. Same thing with our nonprofit organizations. You talk in the book about women's suffrage as an example. You talk about the civil rights movement, and you also talk about community, which you just touched on. Why did you choose those as the examples of how we can begin to think about moving forward?
Well, that's great. I mean, and one of the things that I haven't spoken that much about, so I think that the civil rights movement provides some great examples. I mean, first and foremost, the civil rights movement is the movement that is the most studied in anywhere in the world, right? So we know the most about it. There's a wonderful documentation and wonderful scholars who have spent their lives helping us to think about this. And I learned from that. So it was the perfect place to start. But one of the things that it's interesting because I teach a social movements class every year. And as I was working on the book, I kept rereading Alden Morris's work and Doug McAdams' work and these accounts that historically, like I started reading in graduate school because they were the ones you have to read. And now it's amazing because reading Alden Morris's account of the ways that organizations that were starting to do civil disobedience and this radical flank were embedded in the black churches in the way that the churches provided homes for these activists who were doing stuff that a lot of the elders did not support. But they still provided a home and a space for it. And that's the kind of community that we do not see right now. And it really concerns me. So I just saw that there are just so many places we can learn from the way the civil rights struggle happened, even though there's obviously a lot more work still to be done there. Women's suffrage I brought in because the women were really violent. And it's something that we don't think about. And people don't talk about it. Like, so do you know that there was a period of time when at least one building was blown up a month during women's suffrage? Women ran and tried to block like horses in parades and get stampeded and like intentionally, sacrifice themselves, let's just say it like that, as part of their struggle. They did all of these very aggressive actions. I mean, and they did slash. I know today there was a painting that was slashed, so people are following in their footsteps. They slashed a lot of artwork. And so I think there's something really important to remember and to learn from these different struggles. But I also think the other point to make here is that in both cases, we've really sanitized the memory of these movements. And so, I mean, particularly the civil rights movement, and actually there's a wonderful book called The Struggle for the People's King, which is all about the memory of MLK and the civil rights movement and how the movement was sanitized as the movement became part of our kind of historical memory for the United States. But it's a wonderful book, first of all, so everybody should check it out. But in addition to that, it really, when Haj was here, I went to her talk, and we were talking afterwards, and I was just thinking, that's exactly it, because it's impossible to hold up a movement that's been sanitized so they take out all the grit that is how movements actually happen from the memory. So now you have all these people saying, well, MLK was so popular, why, this climate movement is unpopular, therefore climate movement shouldn't happen. And that's absolutely untrue. And I have the data from the 1960s to show that. But I mean, also, the women were not popular either during suffrage, right? So these were unpopular movements, but they made real social change and were successful. But we don't think about that part. So I wanted to kind of shine a light on that and learn from that.
Yeah, and we forget that Dr. King was not supported for much of his time with us. So it's always interesting how, as you said, we sanitize sort of history. Maybe that's why we continue to take books out of schools, but that's for another conversation.
For sure.
It's interesting. So we know the civil rights movement and some of the other movements that you mentioned. As we begin to fast forward, we have the Sunrise Movement. This is 0 Hour, a number of different movements. Of course, the work that Greta has done and how that has grown. Can you talk a little bit also about, for a movement to be successful, it has to have infrastructure. It has to understand what its strategic sort of planning is. And do you feel that that infrastructure is in place for when we start to look at, as you bring into your book, around sort of the radical aspect, how do we make sure that there's both that yin and yang that's in place to make sure that success actually happens?
Yeah, I think the infrastructure point is really important, and I do not think that the groups to do nonviolent civil disobedience effectively, in my opinion. I mean, and people can do it, and people are doing it. These shockers are doing it now, getting a lot of attention, getting a lot of media hits, which I know is the big metric that they're using. But for them to build to lasting change, there has to be infrastructure there for it to persist and for it to reach down into community in real ways. And I have to say that I have been, I've been very lucky having, I just moved to American University this summer, and the Sunrise branch at American is very, very large. We have a big hub. They're also very connected to National Sunrise, and I am now the advisor to just about all the leaders there in the program. So I have learned a lot about Sunrise, but I have to say that the way that they are embedding in the schools and in the struggles that are locally embedded and focused while also having a national lens that they're using, I mean, that's exactly what needs to happen. I mean, the other thing that I think is really important is for these types of groups that are not, when the groups are organizing on Signal and everybody is completely anonymous to one another, it's the opposite of community. And I understand why people do it because they don't want to be targeted. But I don't know how a movement can be successful if I don't even know that you and I are in solidarity and working together because you have, an anonymous name and I'm, Little Bo Peep or whatever on Signal. And I think that that's something very interesting. I talk about that in the book because even the activists say to me, they're like, they don't even know that I was at their protest because they don't know who I am. And I think we're losing a lot there. So I think that when we look back, the groups that are going to last are going to be the ones that are building real community and also are building in little successes along the way, because I think that's also very important. So having small successes like on a campus, while you're also trying to, get the administration to declare a climate emergency or, phase out fossil fuels, which is not a little ask, right? And not a light lift there. So I think all of those things are really important. The groups that I worry about are the ones that are really distributed and don't have a lot of support for one another. That happens when movements go what we call as in abeyance, which is when the movement starts to shrink down and people get exhausted. I mean, this is a long struggle. People will get exhausted, and I'm fully confident that more people will rise up because they're going to be affected by the climate crisis. But for the movement to grow and to become more strategically capable of systemic change, it needs to build those roots and have that capacity.
We know young people have played an incredible role in many of our social movements, if you will. But elders also play a role. Our good friend Bill McKibben, he's created a new organization. Can you talk a little bit about the role that elders play if we're truly going to have an intergenerational movement and one that's reflective of everyone?
Yeah, I mean, so I have to say, I just did on Monday, I did a briefing with, or I guess a book talk with Third Act DMV, which is, they're awesome. I mean, and so what's really interesting about the climate movement right now is that when we look at the demographics of the people who are most engaged and those that are doing civil disobedience, it's bimodal. This is the word that we use in the social sciences, which basically means we've got young people and we've got older people. And there are not a lot of people who look like you and me actually in there, because as we know, when movements are smaller, it's the people who have the time available who are the ones who engage. And we're in one of those moments right now. But I think it's completely thanks to Bill McKibben that we see so many elders. In the UK, when Extinction Rebellion emerged, it actually emerged mostly with elders as well, which is very interesting because people always think that it's going to be the young people. Here in the United States, Third Act is doing such interesting work, and they consider themselves to be like activist mentors and supporters for the youth and to provide, experience, knowledge, and capacity. And they're really doing that, and it's wonderful. And they're also in a distributed structure. They're also disruptors. They're doing these campaigns around moving money out of banks. They're doing these, but they're also doing these performative actions. And if you've ever been to an action with them and their colorful rocking chairs, they call themselves a Rocking Chair Rebellion. And it's amazing because I did this event this week and I had seen Third Act at Earth Day last year in DC. And I had gone out and I had surveyed. So this was part of trying to get the rest of the data for the book, right? So I was out there and it was mostly young people. It was like Sunrise was really in full force. There was some Extinction Rebellion. They had an action plan. And then there were the elders in their rocking chairs around the edges. And I remember they really asked me a lot of questions before they filled out my survey. But it was so funny because when I talked to them, they're like, I did your survey. And I was like, you're in the book. Oh, I'm in the book, So it was so funny. But they're doing such important work. And I do think that having elders there, in some ways it's similar to what we saw during the civil rights movement with elders, particularly through the churches. But I don't know that people recognize how much of an important role they can play, but I think it's wonderful they're there, and hopefully as the movement grows, they will provide infrastructure because they have that structure and they have these kind of hubs that are building all over.
Mm-hmm. And lessons learned.
Yes.
It's always interesting taking a look at different societies and whom actually honors our elders and whom is sort of moving away from that. And there's just a missing component, I feel, that when we don't have elders being honored, but also the ingenuity and innovation that young people bring. We can bring all that together. I think it's a powerful mix.
Absolutely. And I think, some elders don't get as respected as they should, but still, I think that these elders are really, they're showing up. And that's one of the things is when there's a big action, they show up. And my favorite part is they show up with their rocking chairs. And I don't know if you've ever seen that, but they put the rocking chairs on their head and they walk. And so I just was at one of the events around the White House Correspondents' Dinner last spring, and we had the rocking chairs on their head, and they're walking. And all of a sudden, I was with one of my undergrads who was helping me collect data. And he's like, "Where'd the rocking chairs go?" And they snuck around and ended up all of a sudden they're sitting in the rocking chairs, rocking in the middle of the road. They're like, "You want to move me? I'm retired, you know." And it was just, but it was fabulous. I mean, it was, first of all, it was a perfect image, and it was so great for these young people who were all ready to, you know, get angry and be like, "Look, you just have to sit down in your rocking chair." And they set such a great example, I thought.
Yeah, it's a great art from the 50s and 60s of the elders that I speak to, and how their activism was at that time, and then still seeing them today, finding ways of staying connected and giving back. I know we're running short on time. I'm enjoying the conversation so much that I wasn't paying attention to the clock, and I know we have some folks who are going to be asking some questions. Before we turn the mic over here very quickly to folks, vision for the future. What do we need to do to be able to navigate? Because we can't stop the climate crisis. But what are the steps that we need to do to navigate?
Well, I have those 3 steps in the book, but I think the first thing we need to do is I think we need to really, well, it's funny because so my book, Activism Inc., that came out in 2006, basically talked about, it decried the lack of infrastructure on the left in the United States. And then I wrote a book in 2019 called American Resistance, and I talked about how the resistance was the product of the lack of infrastructure on the left. And we still are lacking infrastructure, but I think, I mean, what we really need to do is we need to take that moment and really build that infrastructure, and it should go all the way down to communities and connect us all. And, you know, it's funny because I was a student of, you know, social capital, studied, you know, Putnam, I studied Scotchball, and, you know, it's so funny that now I'm turning back to this, but I really do think that the only way for us to get, you know, to really make progress is not jump on airplanes and fly all over and try to fix their problems over there, but rather do what we need to do in our communities, and then work with the other communities around us in solidarity, and think about that. So that would be my advice.
That's powerful. I want to go to the audience very quickly. We have a microphone that's here for folks who have a question for Dan. Sir, you have the first question.
I've got 2 questions for you. The first one is, I think you might have more luck and get more followers if you changed the focus of the protests away from climate and toward pollution, such as nitrogen-based pollution and plastic, things like that. You have 500 of the world's top scientists, and more now, had signed a petition saying that climate changes, and it might be getting warmer, but it has absolutely nothing to do with anything that people do, and that carbon dioxide is actually good, and that carbon dioxide does not cause warming, but the warming causes the carbon dioxide, which gives people bumper crops and lots of food, which we need. And the other thing is that sometimes maybe the movement has been co-opted the same way that we had the COVID vaccine type thing that was brought about, and by groups that wish to change our form of government, like in a Mayo China type lockdown type situation that they had in the 40s and 50s, and many tens of millions of people died, and even the activists died as well. So it's maybe people need to look at history as well.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think first and foremost, with regard to this comment about thinking more broadly about the environment and pollution and plastics, I think that absolutely should be embedded into the struggle. And I do think that there are factions of the movement that are thinking about that more broadly. I do think it's important to note, I mean, I follow the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is consensus science with regard to the science of climate change. And while there is some fringe folks who are not actually peer-reviewed scientists who have differing opinions, I am one who has worked with the UN and with the IPCC, and I'm very confident in that. So, but I think these are really important points. So thank you.
What do you think of the candidacy of RFK Jr.? A lot of people think it's just Biden and Trump, but actually RFK Jr. is rising in the polls and he could actually win. And I could mention 2 things that have to do with your talk, And
We
one,
just want to make sure
Yeah.
there's other people.
Oh,
that
just
want
very
it,
quickly.
so.
one of them is that the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture shutting down all these farms for just growing organic foods, and also he claims that he can stand up to regulatory capture better.
Interesting.
And maybe we can circle around afterwards and answer second questions. Sir, you're next.
You mentioned, this is politics and prose after all, so emphasis on the politics here. You mentioned the importance of the coming November election in relation to climate and the climate risk. And you, as part of that, you mentioned that the lower, at least the younger part of the bimodal distribution is being coached, by some people to not vote. Can you help me understand?
Well, okay.
Kind of.
Sorry.
If you feel there are two sides to that issue, in any case, help me understand what the rationale is, given the significance of November's election and so forth. Is there a cogent argument being made by anyone? And
Well, okay, let me.
I don't get it.
Yeah, no. So let me start with saying. I mean, it's an important question. Let me start by saying that when I have been at events where I have youth activists who tell me that, I spend a good deal of time afterwards reminding them of, first of all, 2000 election and what happened there, as well as the importance of their vote and their participating in our democracy. So I will tell you what the argument is, but I'm not saying it because I believe that it is my argument, but just to say that the argument is that the Biden administration does not care, is not doing enough, and is supporting genocide in Palestine, and therefore it can't be supported. That is the argument, and the challenge is to explain how. I mean, and then there are some arguments that how they're both the same, and why even vote at all, right? Which obviously, I end up arguing with one of these activists at the time when they said that, and I did bring up 2000, and they're like, well, I wasn't even born, so, it doesn't matter to me. But so anyway, I mean, that is the argument, is a challenge, and I think that for all of us, one of the best things we can do is talk to young people in our world and in our networks, and explain to them the importance of the election, the importance of the outcome of the election, and what the implications will be based on the candidates running. How's that?
Are older people also similarly?
No, they are. No. They are all very, very strongly believing that if you're not going to vote, then you need to shut up. And, they're not going to shut up.
Thank you so much for your great talk. I'm so looking forward to reading your book. I was curious in your research process for bringing all of these points together. Did you look at any examples from other countries? I, for example, used to live in Argentina, and I got to witness their climate movement up close, and of course different country, totally different circumstance and history, but my takeaway was that they are already a more collectivist society than we are here in the US, and so I was wondering, do you think we should take notes from Latin American countries? I know that's a broad brush statement, but I thought that was interesting to observe.
No, it's a very important comment. I mean, so I would just say, so I have done research in a lot of advanced industrialized nations, and spent time in Europe and have spent time with some of the activists there. I can't speak to, I know that there is a lot of differences, well, particularly in countries, developing countries that are facing kind of much more extreme crisis and also have contributed less. The movements are very different, and in some cases the countries are much less democratic than ours, and therefore the civil society has a lot more challenges, right? But with regard to this idea of thinking through the variation in countries that have more of a collectivistic kind of perspective versus others, it's a really important question. And I would just say that, we need to be doing this kind of research to look across countries and see where cultures are more effective and where they aren't, and where more political structures are more or less effective, so that we understand that. In this project, it was the United States. I have done work in the US, Japan, and the Netherlands previously, and my first book was comparing the three of them. So I have a sense of that, but there's so much more to be done. And I have some colleagues who do great work in Latin America, and I know what you're talking about. So hopefully more work can be done. Maybe you should do something.
Thank you.
There it is. Well, I just want to say thank you for your truth and everything that you continue to do for the movement. Dr. King once said that we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. So that means that we've got to figure this out together, how we're going to make real change happen. If everyone could please give Dana a round of applause. And don't just applaud, but also make sure that you get the book, which will be really, really important. I believe you're going to do a book signing afterwards. And we just want to thank everyone for coming out. And thank you also for everything that each and every one of you do to make sure that we are addressing, one of our greatest threats that we're facing in our lifetimes. So thank you so much.
Thank you.